Ship design should be a fun and easy part of gameplay, but without a proper tutorial in Starfield, it takes a while to learn. So this video serves as a breakdown for complete beginners in ship designing. Let's get into it. The first step of ship design is finding a ship builder. Ship builders and technicians can be found at the major cities, ship stations, and at your own outposts. Since this is a beginner's guide, I'll be focusing primarily on cities and more specifically on New Atlantis, since everyone has access to this from the beginning of the game. First things first, you'll need to locate New Atlantis' port, either by fast traveling to your docked ship while at New Atlantis, or fast traveling to the city itself, since this is where your ship will land every time you fast travel to New Atlantis. After exiting your ship, head straight but slightly to the right to this kiosk displayed here on screen, which is the Ship Services kiosk, where you'll find the ship technicians. The Ship Services technician is the individual at each port whom you get access to your ships from. At the other cities, the person will look slightly different, like this guy here, but this is the name you'll be needing to look for. Step number 2 is simply whether to upgrade your ship or to start designing your own. After initiating a conversation with the Ship Services tech, you'll need to select the View and Modify Ships option, which opens up the ship editor.
Sure, how bad?
The first look at the editor throws a lot of information at you. We'll break it down a little further later on, but for now, this interface is just a ship selection screen. And luckily the controls for PC and console are pretty similar in the designer, so besides a few specific examples, I'll leave it to the game's UI to be showing the controls. The interface shows general stats, power availability, what ship is selected, the credits you have available, and your options for that selected ship. Since this is the start of the game, the only ship available is the Frontier, so we can go ahead and focus on the editor options. The difference between upgrading the ship versus using the builder is that upgrading only changes current parts, like choosing different weapons or upgrading a reactor in your ship. Without knowledge of the parts in Starfield, it's hard to tell the difference whether you're upgrading or even downgrading your ship, since the interface shows a lot of information that's especially difficult to understand at the start of the game. If you select the option to upgrade something, it doesn't show you the other options you haven't unlocked yet. It only shows you the options you have access to, whether it's level locked or perk locked. It's best to only use the upgrade option if you want to avoid the builder altogether, or you know exactly what upgrade you want ahead of time. After exiting the upgrade interface, it's time to move to the ship builder, which gives you access to actually getting to design your ships. The ship builder interface uses the same style on both PC and console, using a cursor that can move and select individual parts rather than using menus to select things like with the upgrade tab. This allows you to look at your ship from all different heights and positions, which I'll touch a little bit more on later. The designer gives you access to see all perk locked and currently available parts, while also giving you nearly full control over where you can place the parts with nodes, which I'll get into more later. Furthermore, it gives you the ability to change the color of your ship, you can make copies of your ship to see which version you like better, and so much more. To sum up step number 2, deciding whether to use the upgrade tool or the builder tool is up to you, but there are pros and cons to each side. The rest of the tutorial will be focusing on the ship builder and designer, so if you would like a short or some type of video on the ship upgrade mechanics, let me know down below and I might be able to work on something like that. Now that we're on to step 3, it's time to get to know the designer a little bit better. The first thing we'll look at is the controls. Whether you're playing on console or you're using a PC, most controls can be found in the bottom right corner of the designer. There are some alternate controls you might see pop up as well, but for now we'll just be looking at the basic movement mechanics. When using a controller, moving the left analog stick will move you directionally in whatever position you press it to, whereas the right analog stick rotates and pans the camera in whatever direction you are looking to rotate to. Using the right trigger zooms you in and the left trigger zooms you out. Pressing the D-pad up will move the height of the camera up, and down will be moving the camera down. This is used in more leveling in your builds, so the game indicates which height you are at on the right side during editing at all times, with 0 being the central plane of your creation. Selecting and manipulating parts can be done by moving the cursor over the object you want to move and pressing the A button. Then you can use the left stick to move the part around. When selecting a module that has multiple parts attached to it, all connected parts will also be selected and moved as well. A quick way to select everything connected to a module is by pressing the left bumper on the controller when hovering the cursor over the creation. This allows you to select large chunks of things you're working on if you wanted to move them, delete them, or color them, but we can touch on that at another time. Using the right bumper will allow you to select parts one by one that you may want to move around. This can be important if you like seeing what you're building layer by layer, or if you just wanted to select a few parts to move it away from your build. When using keyboard and mouse, you can either use the arrow keys or your WASD for directional movement, that is forward, left, back, and right respectively. Clicking and dragging the right mouse button will also allow you to rotate and pan your camera in whatever direction you wanted to look. Scrolling the mouse wheel up will zoom you in, and scrolling down will zoom you out. Lastly, we have height manipulation, using the R and F keys to go up in height and down in height respectively. It shows the height at which you are building at all times on the right hand side as well. When using keyboard and mouse, you can select and move items by moving the cursor on top of the item you want to use, click and hold the left mouse button, and drag the mouse in the direction you want to move the module. If you select and move a module that has components attached to it, it will move all of the components with the part at the same time, so you don't have to select each of them individually. Double-clicking the mouse button on your creation selects all parts that are connected, allowing you to move, delete, or even paint the whole thing, which I'll go over some other time. You can select and create a group of individual parts by holding the left control key while selecting modules. This allows you to move chunks of your ship, which can be useful if you want to split your ship into different layers or remove portions of the ship, which I'll touch on later. Now before we get to the next step of adding parts, there's two more crucial controls I need to go over first, since a lot of the parts in the game rely on these mechanics. The first of the two crucial controls is being able to undo or redo something that you did in the builder. Whether you accidentally moved something or you might have removed something, undo and redo is incredibly useful. On controller, pressing the D-pad left will undo the most recent thing done, and pressing it to the right will redo the most recent thing that was undone. On keyboard, you press the left control key and Z to undo something. Pressing Y with the control key will only redo something that was recently undone. This mechanic can track back to the first thing that was altered inside of the builder, and as soon as something else is modified, the redo option is no longer available, so be careful if you're using this mechanic. As a side note, you can cancel at any time if you're accidentally moving a part that you're not meaning to. You can do that by pressing B on a controller and Tab on the keyboard. The second thing is that some items in the builder have different variants, as well as some modules can be flippable. The user interface shows you if the selected item can be rotated or changed and what key is used to do it. On controller, you use the D-pad left or right, and on keyboard, you use the arrow keys. To flip or rotate a flippable object, you press Y on controller and Z on the keyboard. This is important since some items that may not be able to link to a module might actually have another variant that can, or be rotated in a way that makes it attach. Now that we're coming into step number 4, it's time to get creative. Starfield has tons of parts and modules you can use to build ships. Some items are locked behind a level cap or skill set, but most of the visual modules are available from the beginning of the game. Now in order to build things, you will need some credits. But for real though, after a few of the main missions, you will have more than enough money to design something, so don't stress about that. Starfield's catalog of items is organized in sections related to their purpose, and has its own dedicated menu as well. In order to access this, you move the cursor to an open space and press A on a controller or G on a keyboard. To navigate left in the catalog, you press the left bumper or Q, and to navigate right, you press the right bumper or T. You can close out of the catalog at any time by pressing B or Tab. Now I'll get rid of this input display and we'll go over some of the categories. The structural modules are generally for visuals and will always add mass to your ship. I wouldn't worry too much about mass since most of these don't add very much to your ship, but I will go over that later. Some items will add other changes to your ship, like portholes will add windows when placed on habitat modules, and weapon mounts allow you to put hardpoints at different places on your ship. A lot of these parts will have multiple variants and are also going to be flippable, so feel free to experiment with any of them. Depending on which starport you're at, these parts are going to be different as well, because each of the different manufacturers have a different style. So depending on what you're trying to design, some of the other manufacturers might better fit your building style. The next section is weapons. The weapons in Starfield are broken up into 3 main types. Depending on what you have equipped, this element of the UI shows your ship's rough estimate of damage output in each category. Some weapons are going to be magazine based where others are recharge based. All weapons use power as well, up to a maximum of 12 power draw, and using magazine based weapons will have the best DPS output when minimal power is designated to the weapons. That's a little bit more complex than we'll be going over in this video, so just know that your power rating is visible here at all times, and you can't exceed 12 power draw per damage type. Next is landing bays. This is the portion of your ship that allows ground boarding. Landing bays are one of the few necessary modules, but I'll get more into that later. This is one of the parts that alters the way your ship looks in space, on the ground, and even when you enter your own ship. Other than that, the bay doesn't really change anything stat-wise, and you're only allowed one of these per creation. Following that are cargo holds. As the name suggests, adding or removing cargo holds is one of the main ways you'll affect your ship's cargo capacity, and the UI displays how much storage your ship has at all times in the ship builder. At the start of the game in New Atlantis, there aren't very many options for cargo holds, but as the game progresses, there are tons of different versions someone can use. It might seem beneficial to have a ton of cargo space as you travel the stars, but just as a warning, cargo holds are the most significant contributor to mass and mobility loss. Even so that having too much cargo can affect jump range and force you to add more engines and landing gear to get the ship moving. We'll go over that in a minute, but be careful of making too big of a space bus. Now the cockpit is the helm of your ship, but also contributes slightly to cargo capacity. This is another one of the necessary modules and only allows one per design. This significantly impacts what the ship's flight experience looks like, as some cockpits have multiple seats in the cabin and affect the maximum crew of your ship. There are all types of different cockpits in the game from different manufacturers and different stats, so don't worry if you're not a fan of the starting ones. Docking modules are used for all spatial boarding and starport docking incidents. Yet another one of the necessary modules, you can only have one of these per ship. There are different versions that allow you to dock on 5 sides of your ship, with the only exception being the rear, as blasting your engines towards where you docked might do more harm than good. Fuel tanks are another necessary module in order to have a ship. You can have multiple fuel modules, which will increase your total jumpable distance, but having multiple tanks will increase mass, thereby decreasing jump range and mobility. Having less fuel tanks will just mean you have to travel in smaller increments, but you get the benefit of potentially better movement. Side note, fuel tanks in Starfield actually never run out. Not many people travel out of the settled system, so they may never notice, but fuel capacity only dictates how far you can go in one jump, so there's no need to worry about it. The landing gear are another necessary component of a design. Depending on the weight of your ship, you may need to add more landing gear, since a ship being too heavy means the gear's thrusters won't be able to lift off the ground. Other than that, the landing gear are purely visual and only slightly affect mass and mobility overall. Now, something that does have quite an effect on the ship is the grav drive. This is a necessary module, but like most of the others, you're limited to only having one. The grav drive is the module that allows your ship to jump from system to system. And as important as that sounds, getting better versions of the drive only increases the ship's jumping distance between 2 specific systems. So if you have a lot of systems that are only 15 light years apart from one another, there's no need to upgrade. But if you plan to travel to the edge of the known galaxy, where the jump distances get quite large, you may need to upgrade for the larger jump gaps. Up next is the habitat modules. These parts have the largest impact on a player's in-person experience. Changing the habs gives the player all sorts of different decorations and even can add functionalities for the interior of the ship. This module's largest impact is that it changes the max crew allowed, and can even have workbenches to use inside of your ship. Some of the habs are purely for decoration, and similar to some other parts, each faction has their own versions that all have completely unique interiors. Every manufacturer has quite a different taste on the design, but they'll all be serving the exact same purpose. This is also a necessary module, but like I said before, I'll go over that more in a minute. Yet another necessary module is the reactor. Reactors can be expensive, but they also have the most important job on the whole ship. Reactors give a certain amount of power, and the player can only have one at a time, so it can be difficult to design a useful ship, especially if the rest of the components are maxed out, causing too much power drain. Furthermore, a ship's class is determined by what level of power plant it has, so later in the game, as the player unlocks the piloting skill, this is the first thing that will need to be changed to equip the rest of the other class's components. And lastly, we have the shield generator. The shields are a module that gives rechargeable hit points and can generally be broken up into high recharge rate or high capacity generators. This module is not one of the necessary components, though it's definitely recommended to have one. You don't have to build one to have a ship. And yes, you can only have one generator at a time. It has its own UI element in the builder, and it takes up power depending on which one you have. Just like most of the other modules, you will have to appoint a certain amount of power pips to it in order for it to work, but usually the power pips are only meant for recharge rate. And finally, to end off step 4, we can get to how adding parts works in the builder. All components must be attached by a lock point or node when building, or you'll receive an error message when trying to submit the ship. Some modules have lots of locking points like habitats and some of the structure components, but some have very little, like the portholes. Not all types of components can be locked together, but for the most part, small parts can connect to the big parts. On a ship like the Frontier, they didn't leave a lot of space to add anything besides maybe a hardpoint, so to change the overall look, more modifications would have to be made to the ship, so feel free to mess around. Step number 5 is all about what makes a ship a ship. Here we have the Frontier. It can fly, shoot, use shields, carry cargo. Surely it's a ship. Well, it definitely is, but it doesn't have to do 3 of those things, and it'd still be a usable vessel in this game. This is where we get to the necessary components thing that I've been mentioning. Not all categories of parts are required to make something a ship, so when starting to build something, it's best to start building what you need. But before we do that, we'll look at what's not allowed as a ship. Building more than 40 meters in any direction means it's too large of a ship. Having too much of a weapon type makes it unbuildable. More than one shield generator or reactor or grav drive or cockpit, docker, etc. You get the point. So now that we've covered that, let's get back to building us a basic ship. There's only a few things required to build a ship, and that will be shown by the messages section. So to start, go ahead and place everything the red alerts say the ship is missing. Now if you have the credits, feel free to use whatever modules you like the most, but if you delete the Frontier before you build your own ship, it will give you options to use the parts that you sold instead. That'll make building a lot cheaper, but due to hitboxes, I'll be changing a couple of the parts to components that are easier to build with, as it'll make the transition of building something a little bit easier for me. Now that all the necessary parts are laid out, let's take a look at the new alerts we have. That'll tell us the way we have to organize the parts. First of which is this alert, which just means we need a habitat connection between the docker and the cockpit. Like mentioned before, not all parts can connect to other parts, but habitats can connect to almost everything, since all parts are designed around connecting to them. Next, we'll place the landing bay underneath the cabin and attach some of the other modules where we have space in the back. Grav drives and reactors are usually the most difficult large component when trying to find a place that can hook to the build, since their hitboxes can vary quite a bit, but usually they have a lock point on either the frontmost side and the bottom. Lastly, we have the landing gear, and despite it only having one gear, this is a completed build, since the one gear has enough thrust to get us off the ground. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of asymmetry, so I'll go ahead and fix that, but with only one engine and gear, this is completely usable in the game. Feel free to add weapons, a shield, and mess around in the builder a little bit more, but for now, I'm happy with this little frog jumper. In this video, we broke down where to find a ship builder, the differences between upgrading and designing, the basic controls of the builder, all parts, their purpose, and how to add them, and lastly, while designing our own, we learned what makes a ship a ship. That was Ship Design 101. If you'd like another episode going over stylizing, coloring, utilizing weapons, or maybe some secret insider tricks, let me know what you think down below. That's all from me though. Take care. See ya. Oh, you're still here. I mean, at this point, you might as well click one of these.